in a small, forgotten town nestled deep in the woods. The police station had a strange aura, a haunting atmosphere that hung over it like a shroud. It was an old building, one that had been around for decades and had seen its fair share of gruesome cases. But there was one case that the officers whispered about in hushed tones, one that sent shivers down their spines, even though it had happened over 20 years ago. Officer Jake Matthews had only been on the force for 3 years when it happened. He was young, eager, and ready to take on the world. The town was usually quiet, with nothing more than the occasional drunk or petty thief to deal with. But that night was different. It was a night that would forever change him. The call came in just after midnight. A woman had phoned the station, her voice trembling with fear. She claimed someone had been stalking her for days, standing outside her house in the shadows, watching her. Officer Matthews and his partner, Officer Davis, were dispatched to the scene. The woman's house sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense forest. It was isolated with no neighbors for miles. As they pulled up, the headlights of their cruiser illuminated the dark trees, casting long, eerie shadows. The woman, Sarah, was visibly shaken when she opened the door. She was in her mid-30s, with wild eyes and trembling hands. She explained that every night for the past week she had seen a figure standing just beyond the tree line, staring at her house. But tonight, she said, it had gotten worse. The figure had come closer. It had been standing right outside her window, watching her. Matthews and Davis searched the perimeter of the house but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. It was unnerving, but they chalked it up to Sarah's nerves. They reassured her that they would do a few more patrols around the area and left her for the night. But that was just the beginning. The next night, another call came in. This time, Sarah was hysterical. She claimed the figure had broken into her house. When Matthews and Davis arrived, they found the front door ajar, the house silent. Inside, the furniture was overturned and there were signs of a struggle. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. A frantic search of the house revealed nothing, no sign of her or her mysterious stalker. Over the following days, the entire town was on edge. The police launched a full investigation, searching the woods, interviewing anyone who might have seen something. But there was no trace of Sarah. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Then one night, Matthews was sitting alone at the station, working the late shift. The room was dimly lit, the silence oppressive. He was going over the case files when the phone rang. It was an old rotary phone, one that had been in the station since it was first built. Its shrill ring echoed through the room, sending a jolt of unease through him. When he picked up the receiver, there was only static on the other end. He thought it was a prank, but then he heard it, faint, barely audible beneath the crackling. A woman's voice, whispering his name. Officer Matthews. His blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was Sarah. "Help me," she whispered. "He's coming for you too." The line went dead. Matthews stared at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He tried to call the number back, but it was blocked. Shaking, he went to the dispatch officer on duty, but she hadn't logged any calls coming in. The phone hadn't even rung on her end. Over the next few days, things only got stranger. Officers began reporting odd occurrences. Doors opening and closing on their own, strange shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. One officer swore he heard footsteps following him in the woods while searching for Sarah, but when he turned around, no one was there. Then, another officer went missing. Officer Davis, Matthew's partner, was conducting a routine patrol near the edge of the woods when he disappeared. His cruiser was found abandoned on a dirt road, the engine still running, but there was no sign of him. A massive search ensued, but like Sarah, Davis was never found. That night, Matthews was again alone in the station, reviewing footage from the cruiser's dash cam. He had watched it a dozen times already, but nothing had stood out, just endless footage of the empty road and the surrounding trees. But this time, as he fast-forwarded through the final moments, he noticed something strange. Just before the camera cut out, a shadowy figure appeared in the distance, standing at the edge of the road, staring directly into the lens. It was too far away to make out any details, but something about it was deeply unsettling. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It just stood there, watching. Matthew's hand trembled as he paused the footage. The figure's face, though blurry, seemed familiar. He leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat. It was Davis. The screen flickered, and then the footage went black. The following weeks were a blur. The town was gripped with fear. More officers went missing. Each time, their cruisers were found abandoned near the woods, engines still running. Matthews knew he was next. He could feel it, a constant, oppressive presence watching him. Every night, he heard footsteps outside his window. Every night, he saw a shadowy figure standing just beyond the tree line. Then one night, the phone rang again. "Officer Matthews," the voice whispered. "It's time." He didn't wait. Grabbing his gun, he raced out of the station and into the woods, determined to end it once and for all. The forest was dark, the trees looming over him like silent sentinels. He ran blindly, the sound of footsteps echoing behind him, growing closer and closer. And then he saw her, Sarah, standing in a clearing, her eyes wide with terror. But before he could reach her, she turned and vanished into the trees. Matthews followed, his heart pounding in his ears. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't catch her. The footsteps behind him grew louder until they were right at his back. Then everything went black. When Matthews woke, he was lying in the middle of the woods, his head pounding. His gun was gone, and the forest was deathly silent. He staggered to his feet, disoriented, and made his way back to the station. But when he arrived, something was wrong. The station was empty. Desks were overturned, papers scattered everywhere. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. On his desk, the phone was off the hook, the receiver lying on the floor. Slowly, Matthews picked it up. "Officer Matthews," the voice whispered. He froze, the receiver slipping from his hand. The line went dead. And from that day on, no one ever heard from Officer Jake Matthews again. In the late hours of the night, in a small, rain-soaked town, an unsettling call came into the police station. Officer Maria Sanchez, a hardened veteran of the force, picked up the phone. She'd heard it all over the years, but this call would chill her to the core. On the other end of the line was a man, his voice low and broken, barely above a whisper. "They're inside," he said. Sanchez tensed, gripping the phone tighter. "Who's inside?" she asked, trying to remain calm, though a cold feeling was spreading across her spine. "The children, they're not right. They look like my kids, but they're not. Them. Please, you have to come," he pleaded, his words trembling. Sanchez and her partner, Officer Greg Palmer, were dispatched to the house, which was in a secluded part of town near the edge of an old forest. As they approached, the house loomed before them, the windows dark and the entire property shrouded in an eerie stillness. Rain pattered softly against the windshield of their cruiser, adding to the tension. Sanchez got out first, scanning the area. Palmer followed, both officers moving cautiously toward the house. They could see a faint light flickering inside through the curtains, and as they stepped onto the porch, the wooden boards creaked beneath their feet. The door was slightly ajar. Sanchez exchanged a glance with Palmer before pushing it open with her gloved hand. The air inside was cold and musty, as though no one had lived there for years. But the living room was furnished, though in disarray. Chairs knocked over, blankets crumpled on the floor, and the flickering light coming from a television that displayed only static. "Police," Sanchez called out, her voice echoing unnervingly in the silence. "Mr. Henderson? We're here to help." No response. They moved deeper into the house, weapons drawn. There was something off about the place. Despite the storm outside, the house seemed deathly still, the kind of stillness that suffocates you. Palmer pointed toward a hallway leading to the back bedrooms. "I'll check the rooms. You check the basement." Sanchez nodded, though she didn't the idea of splitting up. But protocol was protocol. As Palmer moved down the hallway, Sanchez approached the basement door. It was slightly ajar, and the sight of it filled her with a deep unease. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open fully and descended the stairs. The basement smelled of damp wood and something metallic, something coppery, like blood. Her flashlight scanned the room as she reached the bottom, illuminating an old workbench, a rusted furnace, and piles of forgotten boxes. Then her beam caught something odd. In the far corner of the basement, two small figures stood facing the wall. Children, both no older than 8 or 9, dressed in dirty pajamas, their backs turned to her. They stood unnaturally still, not reacting to the beam of light now trained on them. "Kids?" Sanchez called softly. "Are you okay? We're here to help." They didn't move. Sanchez's heart pounded in her chest. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing ominously in the empty space. "Where's your father?" Still no response. She reached them, her flashlight casting long shadows across the floor. Slowly, she reached out to touch one of the children's shoulders, but as her hand hovered above them, she hesitated. The hairs on her arms stood up. Then the child closest to her spoke, its voice hollow and strange, as if coming from somewhere far away. "You're too late." Before Sanchez could react, both children turned around in unison. Their faces were pale and blank, with wide, empty eyes. But it wasn't just that. Their faces seemed wrong. Too smooth, like masks made of porcelain, with small cracks spiderwebbing from the corners of their lips. Sanchez stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. Her flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, the children moved toward her with impossible speed. Panicking, she fell backward and scrambled to her feet, aiming her gun at the advancing figures. But when the light returned, the children were gone. Breathing heavily, she scanned the room. Empty. "Palmer!" she shouted up the stairs, but there was no response. Sanchez raced up the steps, bursting into the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, save for the soft static still playing from the television. She checked the rooms. Palmer was nowhere to be found. His radio lay on the floor, cracked as though it had been stomped on. His gun was missing. There were no signs of a struggle, no sound of footsteps, just that oppressive silence. Her heart raced, and she radioed for backup, but the only response she got was static. The entire house seemed frozen in time, as if it existed in some otherworldly dimension, cut off from reality. Then, from upstairs, she heard a faint noise, a child's laugh, followed by a door creaking open. Sanchez didn't want to go up, every instinct in her body screaming at her to run, to leave the house, but she couldn't. Not without Palmer. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a lifetime. At the top, the hallway was dark, only a faint light coming from the room at the far end, the children's bedroom. As she approached, the door creaked open slightly, the dim light spilling out into the hallway. She pushed it open fully, her flashlight flickering as it cast its beam inside. And there they were, the two children, sitting on the edge of the bed, their faces still as unnatural as before. But now between them sat Palmer. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He sat motionless, staring straight ahead as though he was trying to scream but couldn't. Before Sanchez could react, the children spoke in unison, their voices overlapping in a chilling harmony. "He's ours now, and soon, you will be too." The lights flickered violently, and Sanchez's vision blurred. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was the children's faces twisting into grotesque inhuman shapes. When backup finally arrived, the house was empty. No sign of Palmer, Sanchez, or the Henderson family was ever found. All that remained was the faint static of the television, echoing through the empty halls of the cursed house. It was a quiet night in the middle of nowhere, the kind of night that would have passed without event had the dispatcher not radioed in a bizarre report. Officer Dean Miller was on his usual patrol through a sleepy rural town, where the most exciting calls involved trespassing cattle or a teenager speeding on empty roads. But that night, the call he received was different. "Possible intruder," the dispatcher said, her voice tinged with unease. An elderly woman on Dunhill Road says she keeps seeing someone standing in her yard, but he disappears whenever she checks. She says it's been happening for days. Dean knew the road well. It led out to the old McCullough farmhouse, a place mostly forgotten by time, where Miss Mary McCullough, an 80-year-old widow, had lived alone for years. She rarely called the police, so this was already strange. Dean arrived at the property a little after 10 p.m. The moon was high, casting an eerie light over the fields that surrounded the house. The long dirt driveway crunched beneath his tires as he pulled up to the weathered farmhouse. The place looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years, weeds growing tall and the wooden porch sagging under the weight of its age. Miss McCullough met him at the door, her frail figure hunched but her eyes sharp. "He's been standing out there again," she said, pointing to the far end of the yard where the trees began to thicken into a dense forest. "But every time I look, he's gone." Dean followed her gaze but saw nothing. Still, the unease in her voice made him feel like there was more to this. He offered her some comfort, telling her he'd take a look around the property and make sure everything was secure. The yard was expansive, stretching out into the woods beyond. As Dean walked, his flashlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the old barn, the overgrown grass, and the forest's edge. The wind rustled through the trees, creating a soft whisper that seemed to follow him. Suddenly, the beam of his flashlight caught something. In the distance, near the tree line, a figure stood still as stone. It was too far away to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A tall man, just standing there, staring back at him. Dean's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively called out, "Hey! This is the police. Show me your hands." The figure didn't move. It just stood there as if frozen in place. Dean started walking toward it, keeping his flashlight trained on the figure. But with each step, the figure seemed to melt deeper into the shadows of the trees until it was gone. Reaching the edge of the woods, Dean scanned the area, but there was no sign of the intruder. Just the silent, looming trees swaying gently in the breeze. No footprints in the damp earth, no signs of anyone having been there at all. Frustrated, but trying not to let his nerves get the best of him, Dean decided to circle back to the house. As he approached the porch, Miss McCullough was waiting at the door, her eyes wide with fear. "He's not out there now," Dean reassured her, though he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't being entirely truthful. Miss McCullough nodded, but she didn't seem convinced. "It's been happening every night," she whispered, wringing her hands. "He just stands there, watching. He never moves. Not until I stop looking." Dean offered to stay for a while to keep watch. She gratefully agreed, retreating into her home while he sat on the porch, keeping his eyes trained on the yard and the woods beyond. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The wind had stilled, leaving only the creaks of the old house and the occasional rustle of leaves to break the silence. Dean was beginning to think it had all been a trick of the light, or maybe an overactive imagination. But just as he started to relax, he saw it again. The figure. This time, it was closer, just beyond the old barn, standing half hidden in the shadows as still as a statue. Dean stood slowly, his pulse quickening. He reached for his radio, but the static that came through was deafening. No signal. "Who are you?" Dean shouted, stepping off the porch, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. The figure still didn't move. Dean's flashlight trembled in his hand as he edged closer. As the beam fell upon the figure, his stomach dropped. It wasn't a man at all. It was something else. The figure's face, or what was supposed to be a face, was a smooth, featureless surface, like a mannequin, pale and devoid of any human characteristics. Its body was lanky, too tall and thin to be human, and its limbs seemed to bend unnaturally. But it was the eyes, or rather, the hollow pits where eyes should have been, that made Dean's blood run cold. He took a step back, and in that instant, the figure jerked forward with unnatural speed. Dean stumbled, barely able to react in time. His flashlight flickered as he fell backward, the light catching glimpses of the thing's spindly limbs moving toward him. Scrambling to his feet, Dean ran back toward the house, his heart pounding in his chest. Behind him, he could hear the figure moving, its limbs scraping against the ground as it pursued him. He could feel it getting closer, a cold presence creeping up his spine. He burst through the door, slamming it shut and locking it behind him. Miss McCullough stood in the living room, her face ashen. "It's him, isn't it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's back." Dean was too shaken to respond. He rushed to the window, peering out into the yard, but the figure was gone. Only the swaying branches of the trees remained, casting eerie shadows across the lawn. But then something strange happened. The static on his radio cut out, replaced by a voice. It was low, garbled, and inhuman, whispering his name. "Officer Miller, I'm coming for you." The voice echoed through the room, followed by a sharp knock at the door. Dean and Miss McCullough froze. The knock came again, louder this time. Dean's hand reached for his gun as he approached the door. Slowly, he unlocked it and pulled it open. The porch was empty. Only the sound of the wind remained. Dean stepped outside, gun drawn, but there was no one there, just the stillness of the night. He turned back to Miss McCullough, who was watching him with wide, terrified eyes. "He's not just watching anymore," she whispered. "He's inside the house." Dean's blood turned to ice. He slowly turned back toward the interior of the house, realizing with mounting horror that the shadows inside the home were moving. It was just after midnight when Officer Ryan Dempsey received the call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was on the night shift, patrolling the sleepy streets of Bellbrook, a small town where nothing ever seemed to happen. The kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked and where the biggest crime in recent memory was a bar fight that ended with a broken beer bottle and bruised egos. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Officer Dempsey, we've got a report of a woman screaming coming from the old Briar House. Can you check it out?" Ryan's heart sank. The Briar House. That place had a reputation, an old abandoned mansion that had been the site of unspeakable things. Decades ago, a family had lived there, but they had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some say they were murdered. Others say they simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind their belongings, their cars, and a lingering sense of dread that never fully went away. Local kids often dared each other to go inside, but no one ever stayed long. Something about the place just felt wrong, as if the house itself was alive, waiting. Ryan turned his cruiser toward the outskirts of town, where the Briar House sat like a forgotten relic, its windows dark and lifeless. As he approached the long, winding driveway, the headlights of his car cut through the overgrown brush and thick trees, illuminating the decaying structure in the distance. The house loomed ahead, its Gothic architecture casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward him. The air felt colder here, the temperature dropping by what felt like 10 degrees as he stepped out of his car. His breath fogged in front of him, and the wind howled through the branches, creating a ghostly symphony that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. There were no other cars around, no signs of anyone nearby, but that scream had sounded real. He could still hear it echoing in his mind, filled with a terror that sent shivers down his spine. Ryan approached the front door, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as it bounced across the peeling paint and rotting wood. He hesitated for a moment before gripping the rusted doorknob. To his surprise, the door creaked open easily, as though it had been waiting for him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the stench of mildew. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight as he moved cautiously through the entrance hall, his flashlight illuminating cobwebs that hung like veils from the ceiling. Old, broken furniture was scattered throughout the room, and the walls were lined with faded, peeling wallpaper, as if the house had been frozen in time. As he ventured deeper into the house, he noticed something strange. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if he was being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. He called out, "This is Officer Dempsey with the Bellbrook Police Department. If anyone's here, make yourself known." His voice echoed through the empty halls, but no one responded. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere upstairs. "Help, me." Ryan's blood ran cold. It sounded like a woman's voice, distant and fragile, as though she were calling out from another world. Without thinking, he moved toward the staircase, each step feeling heavier than the last. The wooden steps creaked under his weight as he ascended, the whispering growing louder with each step. "Help, me." He reached the second floor, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway stretched out before him, lined with closed doors. The whispering was louder now, but it seemed to come from all directions, as if the house itself was speaking to him. "Help, us." Ryan's pulse quickened. "Us." His flashlight flickered for a moment before steadying again, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. He stepped toward the first door on the left, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. It opened with a slow creak, revealing a bedroom that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The bed was neatly made, but everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. Old dolls sat on a shelf, their glass eyes staring blankly into the void. The room smelled of decay, as if something had rotted away long ago. Then he saw it, a figure in the corner of the room. His breath caught in his throat. It was a woman standing with her back to him, her long, matted hair hanging down past her shoulders. Her clothes were tattered, barely clinging to her frail frame. She stood motionless, her head slightly tilted to the side, as if listening for something. "Ma'am?" Ryan's voice cracked. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, unmoving, the air around her thick with an unnatural cold. Ryan's hand tightened on his flashlight, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But he took a step closer. That's when she moved. Her head twisted around, not her body, just her head, slowly turning until her face was staring directly at him. Her eyes were empty sockets, black holes that seemed to devour the light from his flashlight. Her mouth opened unnaturally wide, as if unhinging, and from deep within her throat, a guttural, bone-chilling scream erupted. Ryan staggered back, his flashlight clattering to the floor as the scream grew louder, filling the room with an unbearable, piercing sound. He turned and ran, sprinting down the hall, his feet barely touching the ground as he flew down the stairs. The house seemed to come alive around him. The walls groaned and creaked, the floorboards buckling under his weight. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the whispering returned, louder and more frantic, surrounding him. "Help us! Save us!" Ryan reached the front door, throwing it open with all his strength. He burst out into the night, gasping for air as he stumbled to his cruiser. The house loomed behind him, its windows dark and empty, as if mocking him for ever stepping foot inside. He jumped into the car, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the keys, finally jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and without looking back, he sped down the driveway, the eerie silhouette of the Breyer house disappearing into the darkness behind him. Back at the station, Ryan tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. His fellow officers could see the terror in his eyes, but when they returned to the Breyer house the next morning, they found nothing. No woman, no whispers, just an empty, decaying house, untouched by time. Ryan never went back to the Breyer house, but late at night when he was alone, he could still hear it, the soft whispering calling out to him from the shadows, "Help us, save us." Officer Jake Carter had been working the night shift for years, and he thought he had seen it all. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to experience. It started with a simple call, a noise complaint from an old apartment building on the outskirts of town. The dispatcher sounded uneasy as she gave him the details. "Tenants are reporting strange noises coming from apartment 305, she said. "Some say it sounds like crying, others say it's something else." The building was one of those relics from the 1920s, with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to amplify even the smallest sound. It had been neglected for years, and the tenants were mostly elderly or people who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. Jake had been there a few times before for routine disturbances, loud music, arguments, things like that. He didn't think much of it as he pulled up to the building. As soon as he stepped out of the cruiser, the air felt wrong. It was unnaturally cold for a summer night, and there was an oppressive stillness that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He glanced up at the building, where the windows of the third floor seemed to glare down at him like dark, hollow eyes. "Just another call," he muttered to himself as he entered the lobby. The elevator was out of service, so he took the stairs, the soles of his boots echoing through the narrow stairwell. The smell of mildew and stale air grew stronger as he ascended, and by the time he reached the third floor, the atmosphere was thick with a suffocating dread. Apartment 306 was at the end of a dimly lit hallway. The lights overhead flickered intermittently, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. Jake stood outside the door for a moment, listening. The faint sound of crying, soft, almost like a child, seeped through the cracks. But there was something off about it. The pitch wavered, and the tone didn't sound entirely human. He knocked. "This is Officer Carter with the police. Is everything all right in there?" The crying stopped abruptly. Silence. He waited, but no one answered. "I'm coming in to check," he called, more to reassure himself than anyone else. He tried the knob. Unlocked. Jake pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment was small and dark, with only the dim light from the hallway illuminating the front room. His flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing sparse furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, as if no one had lived there for years. The air was thick and heavy, like a weight pressing down on him. The crying started again, this time from the bedroom at the far end of the hall. It was louder now, more frantic, and somehow closer. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way toward the sound. Every step felt like a struggle, as if the floor itself was resisting him. The door to the bedroom was slightly ajar, and the faint light from his flashlight cast a sliver of illumination into the room. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. The crying stopped once again, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, and there was a strange, unsettling smell, like rot mixed with something metallic. His flashlight scanned the room, landing on the closet door. It was cracked open, just enough to show darkness inside. Jake swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight tighter. "Hello," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. He hated how it sounded, so small, so vulnerable. He stepped toward the closet, every instinct telling him to turn around and leave. But he couldn't, not without knowing. His hand shook as he reached for the closet door. He swung it open, the hinges creaking loudly. Empty. Just a pile of old clothes and a broken mirror leaning against the back wall. Relief washed over him, but only for a moment. The crying started again. This time it came from directly behind him. Jake spun around, his flashlight darting through the darkness, but the room was still empty. His breath quickened and his pulse pounded in his ears. Then, the closet door slammed shut with a deafening bang, causing him to jump backward. The room was suddenly colder, and the oppressive silence returned, more menacing than before. The radio on his shoulder crackled, breaking the silence. But instead of the dispatcher's voice, he heard something else. A soft, raspy whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It wasn't speaking English. It wasn't speaking any language Jake had ever heard. "Who's there?" Jake yelled, his voice echoing in the empty room. He reached for his radio, but the static intensified, louder and louder, until it was almost deafening. And then he saw it. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light, a figure stood, tall, gaunt, and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its body hunched as though it didn't belong in this world. Its face was obscured by shadow, but Jake could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, drilling into him. Before he could react, the figure moved. Inhumanly fast, it darted across the room, its twisted form blurring as it disappeared into the wall, as if it had never been there at all. Jake stumbled backward, his legs trembling, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just seen. But there was no time. The crying started again, louder and more desperate, echoing from the walls, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. He bolted for the door, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he ran down the hall. The sound of footsteps, heavy, unnatural footsteps, followed him, growing louder with each passing second. He reached the stairwell, his breath ragged and his heart threatening to burst from his chest. But just as he descended the stairs, the lights in the hallway flickered out, plunging him into complete darkness. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Jake paused, his hand gripping the banister tightly. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of silence that comes right before something terrible happens. And then, from the blackness, a voice, low and guttural, like something speaking from the depths of the earth, whispered directly into his ear. "Get out." Jake didn't need to be told twice. He ran down the stairs, nearly tripping over his own feet as he raced toward the exit. He burst through the front doors and out into the cold night air, gasping for breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. Behind him, the apartment building loomed, silent and indifferent. Jake never went back to apartment 306. But after that night, the reports of strange noises continued. Tenants claimed they could hear the crying, late at night, echoing through the halls. And sometimes, if they listened closely enough, they could hear the faint sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, following them wherever they went. But no one ever stayed long enough to find out who or what was crying in the dark.